Okay. I'm Mark Waller. I'm the Associate Head for Extension and Ag Economics, located up in College Station. I'm here to kind of travel along with our candidates for the Marine Economics position. Our first candidate is going to be interviewing today. He did the same seminar in College Station yesterday, so he's going to run through it again for the folks here today. His name is Andrew Ropicki. He's from the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida. He's currently a PhD student there. He has a Bachelor's in Finance from the University of Florida, an MS in Finance from the University of Florida, and an MS in Food and Resource Economics from the University of Florida. So he's spent a lot of time in Florida, and we're trying to convince him that Texas is a really good place just on the other side of the Gulf over here to come and look at job employment. He's got some really interesting experiences. I'm not going to go through all those. All those should be on a protected website that I hope you've been able to get access to if you want to get access to that. His CV credentials and as well the video recording of his seminar yesterday in College Station should be on that website as well now. I think it was probably put up yesterday afternoon or yesterday evening sometime. I noticed late last night I checked and it was up there. And it would appear we're recording this one as well, so there should be at least a couple of shots for people who want to get access to it. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andrew, and he'll go through his seminar. I think he's got an interesting discussion that hopefully you'll find entertaining and interesting, and probably have some good questions for him as we get to the back end of the seminar.
Okay, so thank you for having me. So what I'm going to present today is one of 3 papers of my dissertation, and what this one does is it focuses on all 3 of the papers focus on these fishing quota lease markets, and I'll kind of give some background on those and what they are for anyone who's not interested. But really, the goal of this paper is to use a technique known as social network analysis to see if we can measure market efficiency in these trading markets. So a lot of strange words up there, but I'll cover them as we go. I'd like to thank the National Marine Fisheries Service and Sea Grant, who funded this research through a graduate fellowship. So jumping right in, a quick overview of this presentation. Basically, most of the time I'll spend on this research and tell you exactly what I did and what I found. Then a brief discussion of what I think the extension opportunities are for it. And then lastly, kind of tell you where I am with my dissertation and what the other pieces kind of look at. So first off, all of the research in my dissertation focuses on one fishery, the Gulf of Mexico red snapper fishery. And I am focused solely on the commercial sector. So there's a big rec sector, but this looks at commercial only because that is where the individual transferable quota is. And it's a management strategy, but I'll talk about it more in a minute. This is the most valuable species in the Gulf of Mexico reef fish fishery, which is made up of a number of grouper and snapper varieties, tile fish. It was previously managed using command and control strategy. So you're talking about open and closed seasons and limited access reef fish permits. And what this management did was it led to overfishing was the big problem. In the 15 or so years leading up to ITQ management, the fishery was overfished. They would set a total allowable catch for the year, what they wanted the commercial sector to harvest, and they couldn't time the close of the season accurately. So they always went over. So this was an overfished fishery, and it was also had overcapacity. There were too many boats chasing too few fish. So that's just a little background. This research, what do I do? First off, I analyze price dispersion in this quota leasing market to look at market efficiency. And I use the term non-centralized quota leasing markets. And I'll kind of describe what I mean there in a minute. There are 2 facets to these markets that really make them fall under that category. And it uses a new technique for looking at price dispersion in what should be a commodity market that doesn't require fishing costs or ex-vessel price data. And it's interesting because when you deal with fisheries, you find that a lot of times the data is very hard to get. NOAA Fisheries, who controls a lot of the data, they have they're sometimes leery to give it out due to confidentiality concerns regarding the fishermen and where they fish, and essentially trade secrets on knowing fishing hotspots and things like that. And then also when you get it, it can be problematic. It can have errors and stuff. There are certain things that happen. And then lastly, the other big piece of this, the really big piece of this project, is the use of social network analysis metrics. And this is the first use of this in fisheries, in these quota markets, to look at these metrics and see how they interact with each other and try and use that as a proxy for your information sharing network. And the idea is we might have a market where more informed traders are able to negotiate better prices, and that would be a sign of market inefficiency here. So a little background on ITQ, individual transferable quota. So I use the term, you'll see privilege right, and they don't like to use the term right on a natural resource that's swimming around in the water, so sometimes they call it a privilege, but if I call it a right, just realize both terms kind of fit. But it's the right to harvest a percentage of the total allowable catch each year. So the way this type of fishery management works is if you set the total allowable catch at 1 million pounds, and that's what you want caught in a year, and you give a fisher 1% of the quota, he has the right to catch 10,000 pounds in that year. So that's how they break it up, and they make it tradable, hence transferable in the name. So you can trade it one of two ways. You can either sell your quota, which is the perpetual right, meaning you give up the right to harvest that 1% of the TAC going forward, or you can lease it. And that way you give up the right this year, the other person you sell to harvests it, and you keep the right going forward. These type of management schemes have found to be more effective than traditional command and control strategies. And I already mentioned some, the idea of open and closed seasons to manage a fishery. Another big thing is gear restrictions, what type of trawl gear you use in a fishery could be a command and control management scheme. Some places they've even limited the horsepower on boats. And there's a big fundamental difference between these programs and those command and control strategies. And with command and control, you're trying to change fishing behavior directly among the commercial fishermen. But with these market-based systems, the ITQs, what you're really doing is you are changing their incentives so as to change their fishing behavior. And as I said, Costello's a big researcher out in California, and he did this very big study, and they found that overall they work better. They're better at stopping overfishing in fisheries and overcapacity. And the last point here, tradability can improve economic efficiency and resource utilization. Well, what that is almost universally when they set up these programs, they award the fishers their share of the quota based on the past catch history and do not take into account the harvest efficiency of the fishers or their vessels. And as such, what happens is you don't get the balance that's economically efficient, but you've got that trading incentive now. So what should happen, what's designed to happen, is that the more efficient harvesters will value quota more highly, and they'll buy out their less efficient counterparts, and you should get efficient resource utilization, higher harvest efficiency, higher economic efficiency in the fishery. But the key thing is that's all predicated on the trading market. You need an efficient trading market to get these benefits. And very little research has been done into looking at the trading markets, and that's what I'm really focused on here with my research. So terminology, I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of these terms, but National Marine Fisheries Service, NOAA Fisheries, they love their acronyms. They change names all the time, and these are all essentially the same thing. ITQ, IFQ, they're all fall under limited access privilege programs, rights-based management. They all have a basic premise. If you're familiar with the idea of cap and trade with pollution, Basically, all we're doing here is cap and trade, but we're capping the good. It's not a negative byproduct of our production. We're capping the actual main product of the fishery and then making it tradable. But so I'll try and avoid using any of these other terms. But if you've heard of any of these, they're all fairly similar. The details might be slightly different on how they set them up and what fishery, but it's all the same stuff. So I mentioned non-centralized quota markets, and I want to define what I mean by that. And there are two facets we see to what we term non-centralized. And the first is that pricing information on previous trades is not made available. There is no ticker for these guys to go look at to know what quota is trading at. And because of that, it stands to reason that someone who has access to information might have an advantage in trading. And the second facet of these markets is no facilitation of trade. And what I mean by that is there's no formal exchange. There's no physical or electronic place where these fishermen can go and put an offer, say, I want to buy 500 pounds of red snapper at $3.50 a pound, or I want to sell at $4 a pound. Now, in this fishery, there were two brokers that popped up. One of them is still active, but you look at the flow through these brokers, and it's very limited. There's not a lot of buy-in to them. And the other one went out of business, and he was charging 10% to buyers and 10% to sellers on each transaction. So, gee, I wonder why no one wants to trade through him. But so that's what you find. And if we think about this, given these facets of these programs, it stands to reason that access to information could be valuable, because how do they transact? Well, two people get together, and it's a pairwise negotiated transaction. So if you're looking to buy, you find someone looking to sell, and you two negotiate a price. So given that, it is possible that the more informed traders, the better connected ones, might be able to negotiate better prices in this market. So the study objectives here, I've kind of covered this, but analyze price dispersion in the quota lease market, looking for two things. And the first one I've covered pretty thoroughly is, do some of these traders have an informational advantage that they can profit from in these markets? That's the big premise. And the second one, we want to see how connected this fishery is. How is it one group of traders? Because it's only one quota market. As if I'm in Florida and I want to buy a leasing quota from someone in Texas, I can do that. I can trade across the Gulf, and then I can harvest it in Florida. There are no restrictions on where it's harvested. So it's really set up to be one market. But you're talking about 400 or 500 fishermen spread out over 1,000 miles of coastline. So do we have breaks where we have separate sub-markets in this fishery? That would be another sign of an inefficient market, if we had separate regions with different price signals. So just a little intuition on the price dispersion analysis and what I'm really going to do. So if we assume we've got this firm I that has a profit function where their profit is the price they get dockside for their fish when they actually sell it, multiplied by the amount of fish they land, minus a cost function that's a function of quantity landed. And we subject them to the constraint that they have enough quota to cover their catch. That would be the rule. So if we take that profit function and we take the first order derivative with respect to quantity landed, we get what quota should be worth to firm I. And basically it's the marginal value of harvesting another fish or pound of fish. But really what we're interested in here, that's what it's worth to them, but is it what they should pay? And the answer really is no, or that's our contention, because this is a commodity good. A pound of quota at a point in time is a pound of quota, no matter where you are in the Gulf. The fact that it's one trading market, one market price should develop. We would expect the law of one price to prevail and one market price to to show up, and that price, now it can move through time, but we shouldn't expect to see a lot of dispersion around the price at time t. And given that, firms should have a pretty simple rule. In an efficient market, this is what they would do. If there was a market price and everyone knew it, they'd kind of look at that market price and they'd go, okay, my valuation of quota is above the market price. I should be buying. I should be buying and landing more fish. And if their valuation is less, then they lease out quota. And so this, the research I'm doing here, it builds off of past research, and I wanted to go over it briefly because it's really the only other study that's looked at pricing in these quota markets real thoroughly, where someone's actually dug into the data. There's been a lot of theoretical work on these prices. But Newell, Sanchirico, and Kerr, this is a journal of, a GEAM article. In 2005, they looked at this huge data set for New Zealand. And New Zealand was one of the early adopters of this ITQ type of management. So they had this huge data set, 150 quota markets, trade spanning 15 years. And really what they wanted to get at was the idea, is are prices in these leasing markets rationally determined? And the way they wanted to get at that was the idea that average lease price should move based on market fundamentals for the fishery. So when I say market fundamentals, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things like fishing costs, dockside price you get for your fish. Those are what should determine the quota lease prices in these markets. And they found that hypothesized relationships were confirmed. So what does that mean? Well, it means if dockside prices went up, the amount you actually got for the fish, lease prices went up too. If fishing costs went up, lease prices went down. This is what you would expect to see, and that's what they found. So they found this relationship that prices move with respect to those market fundamentals, and we kind of use that as a building block for our analysis. So our model assumes that at time t, there's a market price, lambda m, that is solely a function of these market fundamentals. The fishing cost, the dockside value for the fish. And that's our market price, and it's completely based off of those variables. And it's what we'd expect to see in an efficient market. But, as I mentioned, we have this non-centralized market, and given that it's non-centralized and we have these pairwise transactions, most of the transactions don't occur at that market price. They occur at a separate price at time t for transaction I. So those are the actual transactions that occur, and they're a function of two things. They're a function not just of the market lease price, the market fundamentals, but there's another set of variables, y, which are specific to the trade, the traders involved. And those variables include their access to information, their trading network position, and where they are within the market. So that's for our analysis. They could include other things, but that's the general idea, is that two things are determining prices, but what's key here is in we assume that it's an additive relationship, and as such, we can take the price that the transaction actually occurs at time t, and subtract out the market price at time t, and we get our price dispersion on the trade, and it is solely a function of those trade-specific variables. So what you're talking about here is the difference between the transaction price and the market price, that dispersion. If it's positive, and we think access to information is valuable, that would tell us that the seller probably had an informational advantage. And if it's negative, meaning the buyer was able to negotiate a better price, then we'd assume that it's possible that if access to information was valuable, that the buyer had an informational advantage. So that's the basic premise. The method we use to do this is, the problem with our market prices, since they don't all occur there, it's an unobservable price, so we have to estimate it. And we assume that it follows a time trend that can be estimated using the actual prices we have. And when we run this estimation based on those prices, we get estimates at time t, pt hat, And those are used as a proxy for our market price. So now we've got the price the trade actually occurred at and our estimation of the market price. All we do is step 3, where we subtract the estimated market price from the actual transaction price at time t, and we get our price dispersion. And that's our dependent variable in this analysis. So that's the model. As I mentioned, so a big part of this is social network analysis to measure access to information. So I wanted to go over a little on social network analysis, some of the basics. So in a very basic sense, networks are used to look at connections between people, businesses, things like that, actors. We call them vertices or nodes when we're talking about a network. And the relationships we're looking at can be really anything. They can be friendships, acquaintanceships, business transactions. In our case, for this analysis, an edge or a relationship between two parties in the network means they traded. They either traded quota, or as I'll get into later, they traded fish in the landings market. So this is a very simple network structure. This is what the visualizations are. This is known, obviously, kind of a hub and spoke. Looks like a wheel. But so the use of social network analysis is relatively new to resource economics. Not a lot of people have done it, but it's got a big following in other fields, and that's one of the things that makes it really neat. All the fields I list there use it pretty extensively, and when you drop the social term from it and you let anything be the actors in the network, the vertices or nodes, you bring in a whole lot of fields. You bring in mathematicians, physicists, heck, even neuroscientists looking at how cells in a brain interact. And what this does is everyone brings their own tools to the table, how they want to use social network analysis. And if you dig around a little, you can find things from other disciplines that are of value to you. And an example would be when I get to where I'm looking at if the market's segmented, if we have different geographic subregions. Oh, thank you. Okay. If we have different geographic subregions, we need some way to define them. And what I used was a network segmentation algorithm created by physicists who are looking at very large computer networks. And then one of the more interesting things is the software I use comes from Carnegie Mellon University. It's called Aura. It was actually designed for counterterrorism purposes. It was going to be used by military intelligence and the U.S. government with the idea of fighting terrorism around the globe. But it has tools that are of value to me, and that's a really big take-home message from this, is that there are applications everywhere for this social network analysis, and I'll talk about some more later. So when you're doing social network analysis, there are 4 basic focuses. You can focus on the network structure, and when you do that, you're looking at, one way to do this would be to compare 2 communities and how they respond to different stimuli, meaning things like a natural disaster, a change in a law that affects the major industry, and you can see how the 2 respond given the network structure, how people in that community interact. Another focus is the role that actors in the network play, the vertices. Does someone serve as a hub where all information flows through them? Do they serve as a bridge between 2 communities that if they weren't there would be completely separate? Things like that. You can focus in on the edges, the actual connections, kind of the same thing. What are the key edges in a network that if these connections weren't there, if these friendships, whatever you're measuring, weren't there, the network would change drastically. You'd have multiple mini communities and things like that. And this research really focuses on that second, the vertices and the edges. And then lastly, you can focus on network dynamics, and that's basically, you look at a network and then try and figure out how it changes through space and time. The use of this social network analysis in fisheries, there have been a couple of interesting papers out there. The first one I highlight, Krona and Bowden, they looked at what are known as co-management fisheries relationships in Kenya, and small-scale fisheries, where you had two different groups or three or four different groups who shared a resource, and they needed to find some way to share it amicably. And so they would come up with these arrangements, how it would be divvied up. And what these authors did was they looked at the networks and how these different groups were connected in these management arrangements. And based off of that, based off the network structure, they were able to kind of predetermine whether the management arrangement would succeed or fail based on how connected the two groups were and what type of connections they had. Another one, the second one's pretty interesting. It focused on the charter fishing industry in the Great Lakes. There's a salmon charter fishery in Lake Michigan, and the authors in this study looked at the captains and how they interacted on these charter boats, and they found that the captains who were more central in the network, who knew more other captains, conversed with more other captains, did better. And that's kind of an interesting finding, because they're competitors. You would expect they're competing for the same business, but being, an integral part of the network and actually, working with and talking to those people who should have been your competitors was beneficial in this instance. And then lastly, the third one is the first analysis that looked at an ITQ or IFQ program, and that they looked at the Tasmanian rock lobster fishery. And a kind of an interesting thing, I told you, with these programs, you're trading the rights to catch fish. With that one, you're not trading the right to catch a fish, you're trading the right to use a pot, the trap mechanism that you catch the fish with. And you get that a lot with lobster and crab and things like that. The programs are set up a little differently. But they did it was a temporal analysis. They looked at how the network developed originally and then how it changed through time. And no price analysis in that one. That's where our research is really different from theirs. So a little background on this red snapper ITQ program. I told you about the fishery, but just how this program functions. So it was implemented in 2007, and it was the first transferable quota program in the Gulf of Mexico. Since then, they've added grouper tile fish as well, but this was the first one. You have both sales and lease trades, so you can sell the perpetual right or lease it for the year. But this research focuses on the lease market, and the reason for that is the size. The lease market is 15 times larger. There is not much of a sales market in this fishery. As I already mentioned, there are no geographic trade restrictions. It can move anywhere, which should lead to it having commodity-type pricing. We should expect one price to develop. And then lastly, you cannot carry over unused quota to the next year. So if your quota allowed you to catch 10,000 pounds this year, and at the end of the year you've only caught 8,000, that leftover 2,000, you're either, if you can't lease it out, it's gone. You don't get to use it next year. And that's important to know going forward. So the data I had for this analysis, I had all the lease trades for the first 5 years of the program. I had the buyer and seller, the date of the transaction, quantity, and for some of the trades I had price. They're not required to report price. So out of 5,129 transactions, I had about 1,300 with usable prices. But in my network analysis, I used all of these transactions, all of these arm's length transactions. And the reason for that was, although they didn't report a price, information was shared there. That was an information source for you. You had to agree upon a price to trade. I just don't know what that price was. So the estimation of price dispersion, our dependent variable, so it was a function of time, and we just ran an estimation with a 10th degree polynomial, and we did separate estimations for each year analyzed. And the reason for the separate estimations was, as I said, you can't carry quota forward to the next year, and you might guess at the end of the year there's a sharp downward trend in prices as it gets to the time where, oh no, I got 5,000 pounds left and I'm not going to get my boat out. So there's a big, it becomes a buyer's market, leasing quota, and the price drops a lot. And because of that, you couldn't run one estimation. It couldn't pick up the idea that you had this steep drop in the last week of December, and then January 1st, brand new product. It would jump right back up, a few days later. and the other reason for a 10th degree polynomial, at that level, we were capturing subtle movements in the markets. We weren't getting any monthly effects. At lower levels, we weren't actually catching that December decline, and all of our December prices were kind of turning out negative because this market price wasn't dropping fast enough to capture the realities of what was happening. So here are our estimates. We have our estimation of the market price, and it averaged $2.92 a pound, and you can see the range there on the values. And then we have our dispersion estimates and the range there. And there was a pretty good range from a negative, roughly $1.30 to $1.13. So the networks that I actually used here came from 2 different markets and 3 different networks. And once again, I want to reiterate, the idea was, that we could gather information based on who traded with who. If more active traders would have better access to information and might be able to get a better price. So the first market we looked at was the Quota Lease network itself. And this is the visualization for 2011. It's kind of a jumbled mess when they get to a certain size. So what you're looking at here are the nodes are our lease traders, the red circles, and a link between them means they traded quota. One of them leased quota to the other one. And we have our one major component, and then these are known as minor components. And kind of the thought process here on access to information is best summarized with this little group here. So if we look and we think about it, this guy, here, I'm going to point, I'm not steady enough. This guy right here might have an informational advantage because A, he's connected to so many more traders. He's a hub in that subnetwork. So he's got access to all those other trading partners, but they don't have connections to them among themselves. And then the other way is he might be in a power position based on where he is. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So that's the first market we looked at. The second one we did was when we got out and we were talking to the fishermen, they all kind of mentioned to us that the fish houses, where they actually sell their fish, was a big information source. It's kind of a social meeting spot, and they get information from the dealers they sell fish to. So one interesting thing with these ITQ programs is that you have registered dealers. Only certain people can buy the fish dockside from the fishermen. And the reason for that is that these dealers serve a very important role. They monitor the catch of the fishermen. So what this dealer does is he buys fish from fisherman A, 5,000 pounds, and he notes it, and he sends it off to Noah Fisheries, the fishery manager, and Noah Fisheries lowers that fisherman's quota by that amount. So that's how they keep track to make sure no one's catching more than they're supposed to. An interesting thing, some of these dealers can also trade quota and are fishers. So kind of a strange incentive they're creating, the idea that you can, sell your catch to yourself and then tell Noah Fisheries exactly how much you sold to yourself. Possible. There could be some gaming of the system there, but so when we look at this network, it's a little different. We've got 2 different types of nodes, and this is known as a bimodal network. And we have our fishers, who are, once again, they're the red circles, and our dealers are the green squares. And a connection between them means that fisher sold his fish to that dealer. And that's another information source. We might think that fishers who sell to more dealers would have better access to information, might have an advantage in negotiating prices in the quota lease market. The other thing we're looking at is, as I said, some of our dealers are also traders. So this is an information source for them too. If you're a dealer and you transact, if you're this guy and you transact with all those other fishermen, those are all information sources for you. You might have an advantage when you go to negotiate trades based on that. So that's how we use this one. But in talking to people, and we talked to the fishermen, and kind of the idea of it being a meeting place, we got the idea of checking one more thing. And the idea was, you look at this, and a couple things really kind of jump out at you. First, the market, the landings market is dominated by a few very big dealers, these guys who buy from a lot of fishermen. And the second thing is, your fishers, most of them only sell to one dealer, two dealers tops. It looks like there's a lot of loyalty in terms of what dealer you go with. And what we thought was, is it possible that these dealers, focus on one of our really big guys right here, is that dealer really the backbone of a fishing community? Are all those fishermen who sell to him working out of the same port? Do they all know each other? Is it possible that there's an advantage to selling to a more active dealer, and that you're in a bigger community, a bigger fishing community, and that bigger fishing community might convey some benefits in terms of access to information? So what we did was we took the matrix this is based on and multiplied it by its transpose, and we get this really weird looking network. And we term this the shared dealer network. And what we have here are fishers, are once again the red circles, but now a connection between them means they shared a dealer. So what you're seeing are these little hot spots where they're all jumbled together are fishing communities around those real active dealers, those guys who are buying from a lot of fishermen. So we want to see, the basic premise is maybe these guys all know each other, and as such have all those information points and have an information advantage over this little group here that's not super connected. And just a kind of one-off side note, the reason it looks so funny is they have these strange drawing algorithms in these programs, and it likes to put nodes that are connected close together and space out groups. So that's why you get these clusters are all right on top of each other, because if you spread it out, like here, they're all connected in that little group, and the same thing right here. So it draws them as these little, it looks like a, handful of grapes or something. But there's the shared dealer network. So we used two metrics to get at this idea of access to information. The first one was degree centrality, and that's a real simple calculation. Basically, we're summing up the number of people you traded with. So in the equation right there, we're talking about fisherman I, and we're just counting up exactly how many people he traded with. Those are his information sources. So we sum all those, and that gets us an idea of his information sharing network. The second one, the constraint, really measures your network position relative to your trading partners to see if you're in a more powerful position. And the formula's a little more complicated, but I just figured I'd give an example. So I took that first network I showed you as an example, and I calculated the constraints here. And the hub, the guy in the middle, has a constraint of 0.167, where all the spokes have a constraint of 1. And if we think about just the term constraint, it kind of makes sense. We'd expect that a less constrained trader, one with a lower constraint score, might be in a more powerful trading position. And we see that. If you look at this and you see how information has to flow, who has access to who, we would expect this guy, H, to be in a more powerful trading position. Not just based on his access to information, but based on his network position, who he knows and stuff. And so that's what we're seeing there is the constraint and the idea that less constrained traders have a more powerful network position. So we calculated these SNA matrix based on annual networks. So we looked at trading within a year. Why stop at a year? Why not a longer time period? Well, the product they're valuing and they're trying to determine what the price is changes each year, because the quota expires at the end of the year. The leases are worth nothing going forward. So the idea was you wanted to focus on the people that you knew during that year. Those were your information sources who could inform you on the product that you want to know about. Past connections aren't of value because we don't know if you kept up that relationship. The networks were unweighted, and basically what that means is All we cared about was whether there was a trade between two people, not the number of transactions. So when we focused on, we did both in the paper, and the weighted networks, what it turned out was unweighted was really what mattered. It didn't matter how many times you traded. You didn't get a benefit from trading with someone over and over again. There wasn't a strength to the relationship. The key was just that you had the relationship. And then we calculated our metrics for the 3 different networks. So in the Lease network, we had 1 degree centrality score, which just measured how many people you traded with in that network, both as a buyer and seller. And 1 constraint score that measured your network position relative to your trading partners. For the Landings network, we had 2 degree centrality scores, and that was the one where you had the green squares and the red circles. And 1 was for your role as a fisher, and that just measured how many dealers you sold to, with the idea that if you sold to more dealers, that's more information sources, maybe you have an informational advantage. And 1 was your dealer score. So if you were a fisherman who traded quota and also was a registered dealer, all of those fishermen you bought, you leased in or out quota from, or that you transacted fish with, that you bought fish with, were information sources that could give you an advantage in the quota lease market. And lastly, we had the shared dealer network, and we had 1 score, and that simply measured how many members there were to your fishing community. So those are the metrics. You'll notice the constraint score is only for the Lease network. You didn't really need it for the dealer network, the shared dealer network, because we were more concerned with the idea of your fishing community and its size, and the degree centrality captured that. And you can't do it for a Landings network because it just doesn't work with a bimodal network where you have 2 different types of nodes. So here's our estimation equation. And when you look at it, N measures the network or network role, or tells you the network or network role. So that subscript lets you know whether we're talking about the Lease network and the measures from there, the Landings network and whether they were functioning as a dealer or a fisher, and lastly what we called the shared dealer network, which was measuring your fishing community. I tells you the lease transaction role. So remember, with our dispersion variable, it's the actual transaction price minus our estimated market price at the time the trade occurred. But each trade has a buyer and seller, so we want to know each of their metrics. We want to know, if the buyer was a well-informed buyer, if the seller was a well-informed seller. And then lastly, we did our trade location, and these were the regions we broke it down to. When I get to the results, the Florida Peninsula is our base, so everything's compared to that. But we had the Peninsula of Florida, Eastern Panhandle, and you can see them there. And then lastly, we had between region trades. There were about 20% of them were people from, things like people from Region 1 trading with Region 3. Here, I'll show you. We didn't want to throw out those observations, so we left between region in there. And here's what the regions look like. So you've got your Florida Peninsula. The little squares just tell you that was an active landing location where fishermen landed fish at that port, and a dealer bought from them. So you've got the Florida Peninsula, you've got the Eastern Panhandle, Western Panhandle of Florida to Eastern Louisiana, and then you've got Western Louisiana through Texas. And kind of an interesting thing being out here in Texas, as I told you, it's not really part of this research, but I broke these up using that algorithm I talked about earlier, and I was interested before I did it in where this group would fall, because they're a little far away from the Texas guys, but they're also a little far away from the Eastern Louisiana and the other parts of Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. But it turns out when you look at how they transact with each other, they're much more closely aligned with this group over here. So that's our trade regions. Our variable descriptions. So first off, we have our degree centrality for the Lease network, and that just measures how many people you transacted with in the quota Lease network. We've got our 2 measures for the Landings network. The first one looks at your role as a fisher. How many different dealers did you sell to? Then we look at your role as a dealer. How many different fishermen did you buy fish from dockside? And then lastly, we've got our shared dealer network, and that just measures your fishing community size as we defined it. And then lastly, we've got the constraint measure for the landings network that, you know, kind of the idea that if you've got a more powerful network position, maybe there's value in that. The regional dummy variables, what region are you in? And then a last one we thought might be of interest is we added a dummy variable for whether the quota lease seller, so the person leasing quota to the other party in a transaction, whether they sold fish during the year. So that meant if they sold fish, they had to go out and fish. And we thought that might convey some information to them. They might have, if they were active in the fishery, there might have been some benefit to having to go to a dealer and negotiate a price dockside, and also to keeping up with, you know, the market fundamentals. What's fuel cost doing? Because there are a lot of people in this fishery who are essentially retired. They own their quota and they lease it out every year. So we figured the guys who were kind of in between might get some information from trading or from actually being active in the fishing market. And then lastly, our calculations for the degree centralities, we made them proportional to the maximum. So it's a 0 to 1 value. Here are the results. And so these first four numbers right here are related to the seller. These are the degree centralities for the seller in the quota lease transactions. And what we think is that if access to information were important, we expect these numbers to be positive. Because what that would be telling us was that a more informed seller, one with a bigger information sharing network, could get positive price dispersion. They could negotiate a price above our estimation of the market. And you'll see we found two of them fit that, and these two in red did not. And I'll talk about them in a minute because they're kind of interesting. And then lastly, or I'm sorry, not lastly, the next four we have, these four right here are for our buyer. And we'd expect exactly the opposite. If access to information were valuable, we'd expect these coefficients to be negative. And the idea behind that would be that if a better informed buyer, one with a larger information sharing network, would be able to negotiate a lower price. So we'd expect those to be negative. And once again, we have an outlier here who will, like I said, we'll talk about in a minute. With respect to the constraint, the network position idea, we found that it mattered for the seller, and it had the expected sign, because remember, it's inversely related to network power. So a negative sign here is equivalent to a positive one for our degree centrality. It just means if you're in a stronger network position as a seller relative to your trading partners, you were able to negotiate a better price. And kind of interesting, when we looked at our regions, we found that prices in the Florida Peninsula were higher than the Western Gulf. So we did have market segmentation with higher prices in the Eastern Gulf. We ran a second regression where we made the Eastern Panhandle our base and compared, you know, all the other regions to it, and found the exact same thing here. So the idea that the Western Panhandle, Florida through Texas, has lower prices than the Eastern part. So those are our results. Here are the findings. So what did all that just tell you? Lease sellers were able to negotiate higher prices if they had more quota trading partners. So that would be access to information. The idea that the more people you traded with, you probably had a bigger information sharing network, and you could use that information to get a higher price, and up to 19 cents a pound. If they sold their catch to more active dealers. So what that measures is that idea we were talking about, your fishing community size. So the members of bigger fishing communities were able to get better prices. And lastly, if they were in a less constrained network position. So that was just our measure of network power, and we found that sellers that were in a more powerful position than their trading partners did get a better price. For buyers, only one of them had the expected sign, and it was that idea of the fishing community again. Those fishers who were members who sold to more active dealers, meaning they were members of a bigger fishing community, were able to negotiate better prices. And that's kind of interesting. That was the only one that was the same, symmetric between buyers and sellers. The only thing that mattered on both sides of the transaction, access to information, was being a member of a bigger fishing community, being at a bigger port, working with the dealer who sold to more fishermen. And then lastly, as I said, the quota lease prices were higher in Florida. So the unexpected findings, those three red ones I highlighted. The first one, the quota lease sellers that were also registered dealers received lower prices for their quota. This kind of surprised us because we figured as dealers, they've got all those information sources, the fishermen they buy from, what's going on. And in talking with the fishermen, we've kind of figured out they have agreements set up. So what these dealers are doing a lot of the time is they hold quota themselves. They'll lease it in from someone, and then they'll lease it out to a fisher and say, here's the deal. You get this quota. It comes back to me when you land the fish. So they're ensuring supply for their retail or wholesale business. Now what's funny is you talk to the fishermen, no one said they were getting a deal on it, a lower market price. But our results indicate maybe they were. Maybe these dealers were ensuring flow to their retail and wholesale operations, and that's the bigger part of their business. The second one, quota lease sellers that sold fish to multiple dealers received lower prices for their quota. And this was kind of interesting too, because we thought, the more dealers you go talk to and interact with, the better your access to information. And what we think might be happening here is when I showed you that landings market, I pointed out that very few fishermen went to more than one dealer. So what we think is possibly going on here is that, those dealers might know that you're going and selling your fish to other dealers too. And as such, they might not share information for you. The idea kind of is, we thought these were people who maybe bridged fishing communities or bridged different parts of the network, and were members of two different groups. Really, maybe they're kind of loners who aren't members of any group, given our findings. And then lastly, the quota lease buyers with more quota trading partners paid higher prices. This was surprising because we figured, they've got more information sources in that lease network. They should be able to negotiate a higher price. And one hypothesis we think is that when I talked about it, we had the general rule. If the harvesters will be buying in quota if their valuation is higher than what the market price is. Well, maybe these guys do have access to information, but they're just really good at what they do. And quota's worth a lot more to them. And if that's the case, maybe they're bidding people into the market, essentially. Maybe they know the market price, they have that access to information, but quota's so valuable to them, they look at that market price and they salivate. And they're willing to go, a nickel, a dime up above that price just to make sure they can insure quota so they can fish more because they're so good at it. So summary real quick, there is evidence of systematic price dispersion in this quota lease market. It's in certain cases, access to information and network position are important, and we do have separate trade regions with different prices. We do see that. What I found interesting was this value of information was asymmetric between buyers and sellers. What mattered to you in terms of your information and sharing network when you went to sell quota and you wanted to negotiate a higher price wasn't the same thing that was important to you when you were a buyer and you wanted to negotiate that higher price. The only one that was universal between the two that was the same was being a member of a bigger fishing community. That seemed to convey a benefit in both sides of the transaction. So just quickly, some of the possible research extensions from this. I chose those two S&A matrix, degree centrality and constraint, because they were very good candidates. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a very broad field, and there are just hundreds of possibilities. So one step might be looking at different ways to measure access to information. Secondly, looking at these networks over longer time periods. So I kind of, I told you we looked at annual networks, and the idea was the product you were valuing changed. maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you keep those information sources from previous years. So that might be something to look at. Say, if you're looking at 2014 data, trading data, maybe it's still key, those relationships, those connections someone had from 2012. And then lastly, another one, this one's a little different, is to analyze how network structure impacted these harvest efficiency gains. And I have a grant proposal. I'm waiting to hear back from NOAA Fisheries, a salt and stall Kennedy grant, to actually analyze this. Because a lot of what people have done in fisheries with these ITQ programs is they will they'll look at a fishery before ITQs are implemented or sometimes afterwards, and they'll say, okay, we have this many boats right now chasing this amount of catch. And they'll go, this isn't efficient. We've got overcapacity. And then they'll do a stochastic production frontier, and they'll say, we could do it with this many boats. And ITQ would get us there because trading would get the job done. And they just imagine that those markets are going to be efficient and work perfectly. So what this one would do would say, okay, we're going to do what you did. We're going to analyze pre-ITQ and see what would have been possible. And then we're going to look at our network structure and those breaks in the market, and we're going to see what actually happened and try and tie it to the network structure. So the idea is kind of what percentage of the harvest efficiency gains that are possible are we actually getting? And that really gets back to the efficiency of these markets and why it's so important. So the extension aspects of this, so first off, the audience is fisheries managers. I mean, it's hard to go anywhere else with this, but it's a value to them because they set up these programs and they need to know how they're affecting the fishermen and the dealers and everyone. And this is basically what you're doing when you set up these programs. You're saying we want a market-based solution, and up until now, we're going to ignore the market for it. So what this does is it allows them to look at how that market is functioning. And beyond that, I think there are some really good extension possibilities for the social network techniques I used and just general social network stuff. The first one would be the impact of network structure on coastal community resiliency. So a lot of research right now is being done in this area on network structure of a community and how it impacts community resiliency. Now, there's not a lot of focus on coastal communities, but there's room there. Looking at different communities and how they respond to natural disasters, changes in fishing regulation, or changes in a competitive environment that might make an industry no longer valid in the region. If we can study the different network structures and see what works and what doesn't, maybe we can go to community leaders and kind of have them try and foster things that will make a community more resilient in the face of negative change. And then secondly, technology adoption. I think there's a lot of work here. Social networks have been used a lot in looking at technology adoption. People have looked at doctors and how they accept a new drug treatment for different patients and stuff. And a lot of it's been done on farming and precision agriculture, because what we find is that within a given field, medicine, agriculture, fishing, a lot of times these guys listen to their colleagues, who they work with. And as such, what other fields have found is that if you can find the key players within a community or an area and get them to adopt, then adoption happens more quickly. And I think there's a lot of room here for seafood producers in Texas with shrimpers and some of the things, the turtle excluder devices or working with their brine tanks and things like that. It's possible to use network analysis to get more full and quicker technology adoption, possibly. So that's the extension stuff. Real quickly, I know I like to talk, so I've probably gone over, but 3 papers, all of them look at the red snapper ITQ fishery. The first one just looked at the basic network structure and dynamics of the fishery, how it's changed through time. It's just good to know for NOAA fisheries to know the mechanics of what's going on in this trading market and how it's developing. The second one's the one I presented today. It's been accepted for publication by Marine Resource Economics, a journal in my field. And then lastly, the third paper's really kind of neat. As I mentioned earlier, there's not much of a sale market for this quota. The lease market's 15 times larger. And what I'm doing is trying to look at that relationship between the sale and lease price. But given the lack of data on sales, I'm using survey data. I've done a mail survey of the entire Gulf, and right now I've got people going out in the Tampa Bay area to get that part of the fishery, because I don't think the sale prices you see right now in the market are indicative of what the true market price is. I think it's a lot of times it's people who need cash now, who are in a position where they have to sell, because when you talk to the guys who are in the market to buy quota, they all say, oh, the price is too high. But then you look at the guys who are retired and are leasing it out every year, and you kind of think of it, for them, it's an investment. They're not going to go back to fishing, so if they sell it, they need a retirement asset. And they need a retirement asset that's as good as leasing out your quota every year. And when you really start to analyze quota as an investment, it's a pretty good investment. It's got a pretty good return, and it's hard to match. So that's really what I'm looking at there, is that disconnect and how it's affecting this fishery. And it's fairly widespread. There are a lot of fisheries out there that are kind of like this, so where the lease market dominates. But that's it. I'm sorry if I ran long, but I'll take any questions or comments or anything. Yeah.
How long can these retired fishermen lease?
No, there's no restriction. They could
pass it on to their heirs.
Yep. Yeah. There's. Yep. And that's the thing. When you actually get down and value it, if you value it as a perpetuity, I mean, right now you're talking about $3.25, $3.50 a pound you can lease it for. And if you think the sale market is indicative of what the actual price is for quota, it's about $35 a pound. Well, you do the formula for a perpetuity based off of that, and you have a 10% return. You go find me something out there that's a solid 10% with minimal risk that you're not going to be able to lease it in a year. I'll buy it. Let me know, because I mean, it's just not out there. So it's really interesting with that regard. So yeah.
Question, you said the price was a little higher than Florida. The size and quality and how the fish are handled, have they do with price?
So it's funny with this one. When I talk to the fishermen, there's not a lot of issues with high grading. The fish is pretty universally valued. What we think is going on is, when you look at how quota was first awarded, the Florida fishery is a little different in that if you're in the Western Gulf, it's red snapper, vermilion, and you can do tile fish, but there's not a big grouper fishery. In the Eastern Gulf, grouper is a pretty valuable species, and these guys could go harvest it. So what was happening was, when the years they looked at for determining how quota was going to be awarded, the red snapper stock in the Eastern Gulf was depressed. So these guys weren't catching much. They didn't get much quota. And the rules as to how they could go out and fish, they either had a 200-pound per day trip limit or a 2,000-pound per day trip limit, depending on vessel size. A lot of them just said, no, I'll go catch grouper. So they didn't get awarded much quota, and now the stock in that area is back. It's rebounded, and so they don't have a lot of quota there. So it's got a higher value from that. And then also dockside prices are higher in Florida, and part of that is just the metro areas you have right there. A big part of the fisheries of the Tampa Bay area, and I don't have figures, but I doubt much of that snapper gets out of the Tampa Bay area. I mean, it is a high value product, and they can sell right into that Tampa market. So, it's more valuable in the retail space than the wholesale if you have to ship it to other parts of the country.
From the point of view of fishery management,
Yeah.
will the value approaching zero be the ideal? So maybe more valuable, and can you manage the
I don't
one
know.
way or the other, you know, to manage the fisheries,
Yeah.
be positive or negative?
Well, I mean, I don't know that you want. Are you talking about the dispersion?
Yeah.
You would want less dispersion. I think the key to getting less dispersion is making information more available. You know, if they would list the last 10, if they require they report a price, and then put something, because all these guys have to go to the NOAA Fisheries website, and they can track how much of the total allowable catch has been caught for the year, how much quota they have left. They could just as easily put up a page where these guys could see the last 10 price trades. I think that would get the dispersion closer to zero.
Right, that was my point. You know, if you know, probably the discussions of these networks are supply and demand.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because you know, I mean, I didn't want to make the argument that this dispersion is necessarily a horrible thing, because no one's being forced to trade. If both parties are agreeing on a price, even if it's above this estimated market price, they're both better off.
My point is that maybe zero is a win-win situation, you know, for kind of making everybody happy, and then as a manager, you might be able to manage information to get you know, a sustainable.
That's hopefully that is. I mean, you know, they're probably not going to get to zero, because it's hard in a lot of markets. Law of one price, you expect dispersion to get low, but getting to zero. But yeah, making information more available, maybe the networks wouldn't matter as much. Is that kind of, yeah?
Well, yeah, you know, to manage the
yeah.
thing, only, you know, too much of a buyer advantage or a seller advantage, but to make it a sustainable advantage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you.
All the marketing is for domestic market, U.S. market.
Yeah, there's not much of a. I mean, I've talked to. There's one big guy in the Panhandle who has a wholesale operation where some of his fish goes to Canada, but this is most of this gets used in the domestic market. Some of them make it up to Chicago, New York, but it doesn't really leave the country. And there's. I mean, there are imports, don't get me wrong, but it's, this one, red snapper, you know, U.S. caught is usually preferable. It does get a price premium relative to international stuff.
Do you know how important is the import?
It's funny. I don't think it's a big part of this market. Talking to the fishermen, there's one fish in this reef fish species, or a complex that's black grouper, and that one you'll see there's a time of year where the international imports come in, and it wreaks havoc with quota prices. But with the red snapper fishery, it's not a big part of it. I mean, these guys can kind of function. You know, they don't have to look at it in an international context. Yeah.
Obviously, relationships are very important in the social markets.
Uh-huh.
What is the ethnic background of all the fisheries? I mean, because I'm particularly interested in that, working with some of our agents in our area.
Yeah. So we do. There is for the most part, it's. There's not a lot of ethnic diversity. There are in Texas and Louisiana. There are communities of Vietnamese fishers, but I think they're more. Those communities focus more on shrimp. There are a few who fish for red snapper, but it's not a super diverse fishery. And that's interesting because there's some interesting research that's been done. Along those same lines, I met a researcher recently from Hawaii who looked at the longline fishery there, and you have three distinct ethnic groups who don't interact a lot. And she did some interesting stuff looking at who was successful and why, and it turns out that the people who, those fishers in a community who reached out to the other communities did better. There's information there that your little insulated community doesn't have.
Of course, with the extension of non-rich education, it's important to tap into those relationships.
Yes. Yeah, and I've heard with the shrimping industry, it would be a very vital thing.
Yeah, I was looking at, I forgot what you said the retail average price was, but I was looking at 12, 13, 17 cents.
Yeah.
More or less, which is 5%,
It's-
something in that range.
Yeah.
So I guess, kind of following up Pete's first question, you didn't have to take into account, when you're looking at that, to me, relatively small
Yeah.
price differential based on connections and whatnot,
Mm.
on the quality of the product. I mean, it's pretty much,
No.
everybody brings it in,
We
pretty much the same quality, you get the same price, you don't get about for.
Yeah, we checked in with the fishers, and the guys in Florida up in the Panhandle and the guys in Tampa we talked to a lot said, you know, there's really just not much difference. We had heard some rumors that bigger fish got bigger prices, but they said that's not the case with us. So, I mean, I really don't think there were big quality issues with this fishery. Most of it, I mean, the only thing that'd be worth checking is if the longliners have quality issues that the vertical line fishers don't. And that might be something to look into, because in the Texas market, I think you have a lot more longliners, whereas in Florida, we've got the bandit reel rigs. So, I mean, they're just, you know, it's two guys, you know, have the perfect job fishing off the back of a boat. But that is interesting, and it might be worth looking into. But we do have longliners out of Tampa, and we didn't hear anything about their product being lower value.
If there's no more questions about the research, I will ask you, what is your vision? What will you do with this?
Well, I've got a list of things. I think there are a lot of things. It opens up a lot of opportunities. Obviously, I think a big part of this position would be working with the shrimpers. I mean, I looked at the stuff, 150 million dockside between brown and white shrimp. That would be a big part of it. And I think the stuff Mike Havey and Russ were doing, are doing, is very valuable. I think, working, and John Jacob and Gary Graham, working on, getting these guys more efficient trawling techniques, things that, take those turtle excluder devices and those bycatch reduction things, and getting them to test new techniques that might cut down on fuel use. And then also there seems to be a lot of work with regards to making sure they bring home a fresh, clean product. So I think there's work to be done there. The oyster fishery, too, there's a lot of stuff. I think there are things I could add to this position that would be beneficial. Like I mentioned, I think the social network aspect, with extension especially, is very valuable. I think we can take some of those things and figure out how to get adoption rates quicker on new technologies that'll help these guys. And then also the community resilience issues. I think there's room to work on things like hurricane resiliency, and trying to determine what communities are in serious danger and which ones have the ability to bounce back quicker, and maybe fostering those ones who are in greater danger to come up with ways to improve, or things they could do that might help. There's some other stuff too. I think there's a lot of room to run with the idea of ecosystem service valuations and on the coastline, in terms of what's the value of different ecosystems. In Florida, we've got a lot of salt marsh, and the idea of what value does that provide in terms of storm surge protection and things like that. So I think there's room to do that, and working with possibly the folks at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. There's an economist there, David Yaskowitz, who does a lot of this stuff. The oyster industry, those are filter feeders that clean the water. They're, figuring out the value of that process could be of benefit to the oyster fishing community. So I think there's a lot to do. I know I kind of jumped all over the place, but
I In the 80s, we had, 90% of the frames was produced in the U.S. Now it's only 10%. We lost a $4 billion industry.
Yeah.
How are you going to help us to recover that, right?
One thing.
Oh, free trade.
Well, I got a rabbit in a hat over here and a magic wand. No, I think there are things, a couple things I was thinking about. They're not cure-alls, but I think that there's a lot of research that can be done looking at Texas consumers. Because in Florida, one of the things we do is, and I mean, there are Texas, Texas Growing, I believe, is the program you have for your ag stuff. But I had to do a lot of digging to find it when I did my research and tried to find it. I can't miss Fresh from Florida. I mean, we put a lot into the idea of our products. We tell Florida people, our fish is better, our ag products are better, everything's better if it's from Florida and it's local. Yeah, and another thing we do is I work with Chuck Adams at UF, our Sea Grant person, and there are constantly seafood consumption surveys going out. We want to know what your concerns are as a Florida seafood consumer. Is mercury high on your list, or are you worried about getting enough omega-3s? And we can tailor marketing to that. With respect to the production, so I mean, we could look for a way. I think the big thing, and I'm not covering new ground here. People have tried it, so I wouldn't want to guarantee success or anything. But it's to differentiate the product. The farm shrimp's not going away. I just don't think it is. So you have to find a way to differentiate wild-caught shrimp. And there might be possibilities for that. If you... I understand there are some day boats. It's not a big part of the industry, but maybe that level of freshness... they could sell into high-end markets along the Texas coast that could help that group. But I think the key is to find what consumers want and market the product in a manner that that they'll see a difference between the two products.
Kind of like a general question, just to see your thoughts on that. I don't know the answer. We did a paper on dietary guidelines a couple of years ago, on the dietary guidelines.
Okay.
2010 dietary guidelines. And of course, they need to consume more fish instead of red. And we did on the production, import, export for the U.S. And the numbers were strange because about 85% of what is consumed here in the U.S. is imported.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. export about 75% of what is produced. And I would just, the way that you think, okay, is it that what we produce, our own consumers don't like it, we send it overseas, or why is there a peak? Where's our peak?
My guess would be, and I'm look at the things we sell. If you look, first off, you'd have to go to Alaska, because that's our big fishery. The crab fishery is huge. That's a high value product. I mean, it's probably better to sell on the world market. If we sold it all in the U.S., we'd probably flood the market, get lower prices. It's a product they're going to value all over the world. You look at the halibut fishery is really big. Another one. Some of the stuff that wouldn't. Cod's really big. You'd expect that to get sold in the U.S. In the Gulf, we sell a lot of high-value products. We have a pretty big tuna fishery. I would think it'd be if you looked at the products that were coming in and going out, I think that might tell some of the story in terms of...
That we're shipping out cheaper?
I think we're shipping out the higher-end stuff. And I think it's... and that would be my guess. But I'd have to look at the data more fully, but... That would be my...
You talk about consumer demand and what they service and all that. That would be something that, if we have the resources, we have the demand because we import about 85%.
No.
And we need that.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Mislabeling issues and food safety issues species coming, from overseas, I think that will be a good.
And that is something, I did my master's thesis, I wrote on willingness to pay from Florida consumers. We did a survey for what we called a product integrity labeling program, because a big problem in Florida is, I know this is a barbecue state and everything, but in my opinion, a grouper sandwich is the best sandwich out there if it's fresh. And problem is, a lot of the restaurants were substituting grouper, which is a high dockside value fish, for basa and swat and some of those Asian catfish varieties. And it was hurting demand, not so much in that maybe people could tell the difference. If they could, they were just getting a negative view of grouper, but more so because the news stories were coming out, and people don't like to be swindled. That's pretty universal truth there. But what we found was that people were willing to pay a premium on an entree for a product integrity labeling program, something that guaranteed, so they would have steps along the way that would guarantee that fish on your sandwich or on your plate was grouper, Florida caught grouper, and it wasn't some imported variety. And it's a little bit of a one-off, because I don't know if you do the product integrity thing here, but with the shrimpers, maybe there's Texas grown, really beef up that label and trying to get them to focus more on the fishing, the marine stuff. So. Is there anything else? Or?
Well, we've kind of, if I can, we've kind of put a little over on the seminar, but the next session was basically open meeting with the extension and research faculty. So I was hoping that we could just kind of continue on to this. We don't have an individual meeting until 11 done, so if people have got more questions or they want to go off on some other topics or things, that can be fun. Were we going to meet before we stay in this room?
Well, we can stay here, or we can go into the conference room. Why don't we take a quick break?
Okay.
And anybody that wants to participate, any of the specialists that like to participate in a one-on-one question, we can meet in the conference.
Oh, okay.
So,